Corpus Christi in South London. One of the 100 or so schools across England disrupted because of potentially dangerous concrete called wrack. A number completely closed before they've even reopened. Repair bills in some schools potentially reaching 7 figures.
And it's not just schools that were built between the 50s and mid-90s using this lightweight concrete that can degrade over time. Concrete that can suffer catastrophic collapse. Hospitals, other public buildings and housing is affected too.
Hinchinbrook Hospital in Cambridgeshire is a case in point. It's had to prop up weak ceilings, and heavier patients can now only be treated on the ground floor in case the roof fails. While wrack's been known to be risky for decades, investigating it is tricky. When Public Accounts Committee Chair Meg Hillier visited Hinchinbrook last month, she was shocked.
The person who showed us around in Hinchinbrook Hospital was a tall man, and his weight meant that because he was tall, he wasn't overweight in any way, he couldn't himself go on the roof because his weight would be too much for that roof. And when they'd identified a problem when someone had been on the roof and they'd seen concrete falling down into the corridor. As a result, they had to spend millions of pounds on an X-ray and survey and then put in the mitigations. But they still have to look at the people doing the maintenance on the roof and look at their total weight, including any tools they may be carrying. I mean, it's almost laughable, isn't it? It's ludicrous that that's the reality for a hospital in the NHS today.
It's also a massive challenge for the nation's housing stock, which is still tackling dangerous cladding and asbestos.
At present, for chartered building surveyors, we probably do not have the capacity to undertake the quantity of inspections that is required. It's going to be a struggle to down tools on all our existing instructions and just focus on surveying the portfolio and quantity of the buildings that are out there that have been constructed between 1950 and the early 80s.
Labour's calling for a full audit of wrack in public buildings. The Lib Dems say the government's dropped the ball.
We're calling for a COBRA meeting because we think the government, the Prime Minister in particular, needs to get a grip on this crisis, and he needs to be the one to understand the full extent of the potential issue facing not just schools, but public buildings, potentially homes, and to put together a plan to deal with it that calls on resources from across the whole of government.
The Department of Health says it has a wrack plan in place, backed with additional funding. The Department for Education says it's working to keep disruption to a minimum. But in Scotland, this entire process, investigating schools, hospitals and elsewhere, has even further to go.
Well, earlier I spoke to the First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, about the concrete crisis as he took part in a rally for Scotland in the EU. I started by asking him why the Scottish Government did not have the full picture from councils about which schools had wrack before the start of the school term in Scotland a few weeks ago.
Of course, these investigations have to be very thorough investigations, and the Education Secretary, of course, gave detail of the fact that pupils and staff are not at risk of safety because of wrack in our schools.
But you didn't know, did you, the Scottish Government, which schools had this concrete until yesterday?
Again, we trust our local authorities, of course. That's why we empower our local authorities to make decisions in the best interest of their local communities. They were doing that thorough review. I believe that review to be a very thorough one. Indeed, we know that 35 schools have been affected, but we also know, and this is the crucial point, this is the point that actually matters to parents, children and staff, is that they are not, of course, at risk in terms of their own safety.
Can you assure patients and staff in hospitals then, the hospitals in Scotland aren't at risk of collapse because of this concrete?
I think it's really unhelpful to suggest that hospitals are on the verge of collapse when that isn't the evidence that we have in front of us now. The NHS estate is quite large, quite significant, as you know, Kieran, and therefore that review of wrack in our hospitals or our NHS estate is ongoing. But from the reviews that have been done thus far by health boards, they don't have any concerns about the safety of patients, nor indeed of the staff that work in the NHS. But that review will continue and is still ongoing.
Nobody's suggesting that they're going to collapse. What I want to know is, can you assure people that they won't? Because NHS Scotland said there's a risk of catastrophic structural failure in some of our older NHS buildings. They said that in February. How many hospitals have you actually surveyed, inspected properly since then?
So the review in the NHS estate is still very much ongoing. It will take time to complete given the scale of and the network, the size of the network of the NHS estate here in Scotland. But health boards, when they do see and examine that RAC is present in the NHS estate, they are taking the appropriate mitigations in that regard for patient safety and for staff safety.
It was a clear question. How many hospitals and NHS buildings have actually had inspections, surveys by structural engineers?
You can ask me the question as many times and in many different ways, but the review is ongoing.
It's because the answer is almost certainly zero. Because so far this has been a desktop exercise. There haven't been any physical inspections of NHS buildings, and so you don't know whether those hospitals are safe.
The review is ongoing, and of course where there is any RAC that is found, of course appropriate mitigations are going to be taken by the NHS health boards involved.
But that will be a worry though, won't it, for patients and staff to hear that there are 255 NHS buildings haven't yet been inspected for this stuff.
Again, of course they can have assurance that health boards will always put the safety of patients, the safety of our staff, first and foremost, and it will be a top priority for us.
Let's move on to the politics and today, because a year ago you were around 20 points ahead of Labour, weren't you, in Scotland? Now it's something like 2 or 3 points ahead. Can you explain why the SNP support has fallen to that extent?
So a couple of things to say. First and foremost, of course, this was a rally about independence, and I'm pleased to say that despite very difficult months for the SNP, and I'll come to that in a minute, that support for independence is still absolutely rock solid. Fluctuates, it's about 50-50 at the moment, but it's rock solid anywhere between 48 and 52%, depending on the polls, and that hasn't shifted. What has shifted, you're right to say, of course, is support for the SNP. We're not complacent about it. I don't think I really have to rehearse some of the challenges that the SNP has faced over the last few months, and I've been making sure that I do what I can to try to steady the ship here in the SNP after a difficult few months.
During the leadership campaign, you said you had concerns about using the next general election as a de facto referendum on independence. You're not concerned anymore. That's what you want to do now.
I believe if you want to test a proposition for popular support, you do that via a referendum. And if that referendum is being blocked by the UK government, well, we have to test it in other ways. And the way we test it is through general elections. So I'll be putting independence front and centre of the SNP's campaign, and I've got every confidence we'll win the next general election in Scotland.
OK, Humza Yousaf, we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. First Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.